August 21, 1831. Southampton County, Virginia. The air was thick with late, summer humidity, the fields heavy with tobacco, and the night unnaturally still. In the quiet hours before dawn, something began moving through the plantations along the Blackwater River. By sunrise, entire households would be silent. By the end of 48 hours, more than 50 white men, women, and children would be dead. And the name whispered across the South in fear would be Nat Turner. Nathaniel Turner was born into slavery on October 2, 1800, on a plantation in Southampton County. From childhood, those around him believed there was something unusual about him. He learned to read at an early age, a rare and dangerous skill for an enslaved child in Virginia. His owners reportedly saw his intelligence as remarkable, even profitable. Fellow enslaved people saw something else, a quiet intensity, a seriousness beyond his years. Turner grew into a reserved, observant man. He married, worked the fields, and attended religious gatherings permitted by enslavers. But beneath that outward conformity, he cultivated a private spiritual world. He fasted. He prayed. He studied the Bible deeply. He spoke of visions of lights in the sky, of blood on corn, of messages carried through Scripture. Those close to him later testified that he believed he had been chosen for a divine purpose. By the late 1820s, Turner's reputation among the enslaved community had grown. He preached in secret meetings, blending Scripture with quiet calls for deliverance. He told a small circle of trusted men that God had revealed a mission to him, to rise against bondage. The plan was not impulsive. It developed slowly, cautiously, in whispers exchanged far from the plantation houses. In early 1831, Turner claimed to witness a solar eclipse that he interpreted as a sign. Whether coincidence or catalyst, it solidified his resolve. He selected a small group of men he trusted: Henry, Hark, Nelson, Sam, and Will. They met discreetly, swearing secrecy. They gathered axes and farm tools, weapons that would not arouse suspicion. The night chosen was August 21. The rebellion began at the home of Joseph Travis, Turner's enslaver. In the darkness before dawn, Turner and his small band entered the house. They killed Travis and his family as they slept. There were no gunshots at first. Silence was strategic. They took firearms only after the first killings, moving swiftly from one plantation to the next. As the sun rose on August 22, the group had grown. Enslaved men from other properties joined, some persuaded, others compelled by momentum and fear. They moved through Southampton County with increasing speed. Houses were entered. Families were attacked. Some victims were killed instantly, others attempted escape. The violence was direct and brutal, often with blades. Word spread rapidly. Riders galloped across dirt roads carrying news to neighboring plantations and towns. Panic took hold. Militia units were hastily assembled. Armed white residents formed patrols. Confusion deepened as rumors inflated the scale of the uprising. Some believed thousands were marching. In reality, Turner's group likely never exceeded 70 participants at its peak. By midday on August 22, resistance stiffened. Local militias confronted the rebels near Jerusalem, the county seat now known as Cortland. Turner's men were scattered after a clash. Some fled into the woods. Others were captured quickly. The organized phase of the rebellion had lasted barely 2 days. In total, approximately 55 white people were killed. The victims ranged in age from infants to elderly adults. The killings sent shockwaves across Virginia and the broader South. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. What followed was not limited to the pursuit of Turner. Retribution expanded beyond those directly involved. Armed groups swept through Southampton County. Dozens of black people, many with no connection to the rebellion, were killed without trial. The atmosphere turned from fear to collective punishment. Turner himself vanished. For nearly 2 months he evaded capture, hiding in woods and swamps not far from where the rebellion began. Search parties combed the countryside. Dogs were used. Informants were pressured, yet Turner remained concealed in a small, makeshift underground hideout covered with logs and dirt. On October 30, 1831, a local farmer named Benjamin Phipps discovered him by chance while hunting. Turner did not resist capture. He was transported to Jerusalem to stand trial. The legal proceedings were swift. Turner was charged with insurrection and murder. On November 5, 1831, he was convicted and sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, he dictated a confession to attorney Thomas Ruffin Gray. In that account, Turner described his visions and motivations, framing the rebellion as divinely commanded. On November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was executed by hanging. His body was reportedly subjected to post-mortem mutilation, though exact details remain debated among historians. His confession was published shortly afterward, spreading his words, and the fear they provoked, across the nation. The aftermath extended far beyond Southampton County. Southern states tightened slave codes, restricting movement, assembly, and education for enslaved people. Teaching enslaved individuals to read became more heavily penalized. Legislative debates in Virginia briefly considered gradual emancipation, but ultimately reinforced the institution of slavery. In the North, reactions were mixed. Some viewed Turner as a violent criminal. Others saw his actions as the inevitable eruption of a system built on forced labor and brutality. The event hardened sectional divisions that would, 3 decades later, culminate in civil war. Contradictions persist in historical interpretations. Turner's own confession was recorded by a white attorney, raising questions about framing and emphasis. The exact number of participants remains debated. The scale of retaliatory killings is difficult to document precisely. What is certain is the depth of fear the rebellion instilled in slaveholding society. Nat Turner remains one of the most controversial figures in American history. To some, he was a religious extremist who unleashed indiscriminate violence. To others, he was a man driven by faith and desperation within an inescapable system of oppression. In 48 hours, Southampton County was transformed from quiet farmland into a landscape of terror and reprisal. The rebellion was suppressed, but its consequences rippled outward, tightening chains in the short term while intensifying arguments that would eventually fracture a nation. The fields where it began returned to silence. The houses were rebuilt, laws were rewritten. But the memory endured, of a preacher who believed he had been chosen, of a county overtaken by fear, and of a rebellion that exposed the fault lines of the American South. In the weeks after Nat Turner's execution, Southampton County did not return to normal. Outwardly, the harvest continued. Tobacco was cut, cured, and packed for market. Cotton moved along familiar trade routes. But beneath the surface, daily life had shifted into something tighter, more suspicious, more controlled. Militia patrols did not immediately disband. Armed men continued riding at night, stopping enslaved people on roads, demanding passes, searching cabins. Fear had altered perception. Ordinary gatherings, prayer meetings, shared meals, quiet visits between neighboring plantations were now viewed as potential conspiracies. The rebellion had lasted less than 2 days. Its psychological impact endured for years. Court records from Southampton County show a rapid sequence of trials for alleged participants. Many enslaved men were tried in special courts without juries. Proceedings were brief. Confessions were often extracted under pressure. Some were convicted on testimony from other enslaved individuals seeking to avoid punishment themselves. At least 16 were executed through formal legal processes. Others were transported or sold deeper into the South, separated permanently from families. Beyond official trials, unofficial violence blurred the boundaries of justice. Contemporary reports suggest that dozens of black people, possibly more than 100, were killed in the chaotic reprisals that followed the uprising. Precise numbers remain uncertain. Newspapers of the time varied in their accounts, sometimes minimizing, sometimes exaggerating. What is consistent across sources is the atmosphere of collective punishment. In Richmond, Virginia's capital, lawmakers convened with urgency. The rebellion forced a question that had long simmered beneath public debate. Was slavery sustainable in a society increasingly aware of its contradictions? For a brief period in early 1832, the Virginia legislature openly discussed gradual emancipation. Delegates argued that the institution created inherent instability, that rebellion was not an anomaly but a warning. Those debates were intense. Some lawmakers acknowledged the moral and practical dilemmas slavery posed. Others insisted that tightening control, not loosening it, was the answer. Ultimately, the legislature rejected emancipation proposals. Instead, it enacted stricter slave codes. Enslaved people were further restricted from assembling without white supervision. Preaching by black ministers was curtailed. Literacy, already discouraged, became even more aggressively suppressed. The effect rippled beyond Virginia. Across the American South, states reinforced patrol systems and passed new laws limiting education and religious gatherings among enslaved populations. Slaveholders began scrutinizing sermons more closely. Religious instruction shifted toward emphasizing obedience and submission, while independent black-led worship services were increasingly prohibited. In the North, abolitionist circles seized on the rebellion as evidence of slavery's violence. Yet even among anti-slavery advocates, Nat Turner's actions prompted unease. Some feared that open rebellion would harden Southern resistance and delay emancipation. Others argued that violence was an inevitable response to systemic brutality. The event deepened the moral divide between regions. The document known as the Confessions of Nat Turner, recorded by Thomas Ruffin Gray, became central to how the rebellion was understood. In it, Turner described visions beginning in childhood, spirits in the sky, hieroglyphic-like symbols on leaves, a voice commanding action. He framed the uprising as obedience to divine instruction rather than political calculation. Gray published the pamphlet shortly after Turner's execution, presenting it as a factual transcript. Historians continue to debate the accuracy of that confession. Gray may have shaped Turner's words for commercial or ideological purposes. The language often reflects formal phrasing that some scholars argue is inconsistent with Turner's background, while others maintain that Turner's literacy and religious study could account for it. What remains undisputed is that the confession amplified Turner's image as both prophet and threat. The plantations where the killings occurred underwent quiet reconstruction. Surviving family members rebuilt houses and reestablished routines. Yet diaries from white residents in surrounding counties reveal persistent anxiety. Rumors of new plots surfaced repeatedly in the months after the rebellion. Patrols investigated reports of secret meetings that often proved unfounded. Suspicion became habitual. For the enslaved community, the consequences were immediate and severe. Movement between plantations required stricter documentation. Night travel was sharply curtailed. Even informal literacy, passing along a Bible verse, recognizing letters, could provoke punishment. Families already living under coercion experienced intensified surveillance. At the same time, the rebellion entered oral memory. Among enslaved people, stories of Nat Turner circulated quietly, sometimes as cautionary tales, sometimes as symbols of resistance. These narratives were not uniform. Some emphasized his spiritual certainty. Others focused on the devastating reprisals that followed. Memory, shaped by survival, carried complexity. Economically, the rebellion did not dismantle slavery in Virginia. Tobacco and cotton production continued. Markets stabilized, but the event altered long-term political trajectories. Southern leaders increasingly framed slavery as a positive good, hardening their defense of the institution. Northern abolitionists intensified their campaigns. Publications multiplied. Speeches grew sharper. Compromise became more fragile. In Southampton County itself, physical traces of the rebellion gradually faded. Fields were replanted, roads repaired. Yet the geography retained quiet markers, creeks, tree lines, clearings, where encounters had occurred. For those who knew the history, the landscape held memory even when official narratives sought closure. Nat Turner's legacy resisted simplification. He had not attempted escape. He had not petitioned for reform. He had chosen direct, lethal revolt. The fact that many victims were women and children complicated interpretations further. Supporters framed his actions within the context of systemic violence inherent in slavery. Critics emphasized the indiscriminate nature of the killings. The tension between these perspectives has persisted for nearly 2 centuries. By the mid-19th century, Turner's rebellion was cited in political speeches, sermons, and editorials. It was invoked as warning, justification, prophecy. Southern advocates of slavery pointed to it as proof of the dangers of abolitionist agitation. Northern critics cited it as proof that bondage bred desperation. The same event served opposing narratives. When the American Civil War began in 1861, 3 decades after Turner's uprising, echoes of Southampton lingered. The war's causes were complex, rooted in economic, political, and moral conflicts. Yet the memory of slave resistance and the fear it generated formed part of the psychological foundation of secessionist thought. Today, the rebellion is studied through court documents, letters, newspaper accounts, and the contested confession. Archaeological research has attempted to identify precise locations tied to Turner's movements. Historians reconstruct timelines from fragmentary evidence, piecing together who joined, who resisted, who survived. The figure who emerged from those 48 hours remains both defined and obscured by the record. A literate enslaved preacher, a man convinced of divine mandate, the leader of one of the most consequential slave uprisings in American history, captured after weeks in hiding, executed, and reduced in official memory to a warning. Yet the questions persist. Did Turner believe violence was the only path left? Were his visions spiritual conviction, psychological strain, or a language shaped by the religious culture of his time? How many lives were lost in retaliation beyond the documented trials? Each layer of inquiry reveals complexity rather than certainty. Southampton County is quiet now. Farms and roads occupy the land where panic once spread at sunrise. But the events of August 1831 continue to reverberate in scholarship and public memory. The rebellion did not dismantle slavery. It did not achieve immediate liberation. Instead, it exposed the volatility beneath enforced silence. In less than 2 days, the balance of fear shifted. For a brief moment, slaveholders experienced vulnerability within a system designed to secure dominance. The response was swift and unforgiving, reinforcing control in the short term while deepening divisions that would widen into war. Nat Turner's name endures not because the rebellion succeeded in conventional terms, but because it forced a reckoning, legal, political, and moral. It compelled a society to confront the instability embedded within its foundations, and it left behind a record that continues to challenge historians, citizens, and readers to examine how belief, oppression, and violence intersected in one of the most consequential episodes of antebellum America. As the 1830s moved forward, the rebellion did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it settled into the national consciousness as a reference point, invoked in sermons, whispered in political meetings, printed in pamphlets, and cited in private letters. In plantation households across the South, parents warned children about the events in Southampton County. The name Nat Turner became shorthand for insurrection, for night attacks, for vulnerability where none had been imagined. In the immediate years after 1831, surveillance systems expanded with greater coordination. Slave patrols were reorganized in several southern counties, their duties more clearly defined, their frequency increased. Armed white men were legally empowered to stop, question, and search enslaved individuals at any hour. The justification was preventative security. The underlying reality was intensified control. Religious life among the enslaved population changed significantly. Before the rebellion, many plantations permitted limited autonomous worship gatherings, sometimes led by black preachers. After Turner, himself a preacher, white authorities grew wary of independent sermons. Laws increasingly required the presence of white supervisors at religious meetings. Biblical passages emphasizing obedience were promoted, while narratives of deliverance, particularly the Exodus story, were discouraged or reframed. The literacy question became central. Turner's ability to read scripture had been cited as evidence of dangerous empowerment. In response, Southern states strengthened prohibitions against teaching enslaved people to read and write. Violations could lead to fines, imprisonment, or violence. Education was reframed not as a tool of improvement, but as a threat to order. At the same time, resistance did not disappear. It adapted. Rather than large-scale uprisings, which now seemed nearly impossible under heightened patrol systems, resistance often took quieter forms: work slowdowns, tool breakage, coded spirituals, escape attempts along routes that would later be called the Underground Railroad. The rebellion had demonstrated both the possibility of revolt and the scale of retaliation. That dual lesson shaped strategies moving forward. Nationally, abolitionist publications expanded circulation in the 1830s. Figures such as William Lloyd Garrison publicly condemned slavery with increased urgency. Southern leaders responded by banning abolitionist literature from the mail and punishing those found distributing it. The rebellion had intensified fears that outside influence could ignite further violence. Censorship became another defensive measure. The political language surrounding slavery also hardened. Prior to the 1830s, some Southern leaders described slavery as a necessary evil. After Turner's rebellion and amid growing abolitionist pressure, influential voices began describing it as a positive good, arguing that it provided stability and civilization. This rhetorical shift reflected a defensive posture. If slavery was morally justified, then rebellion was not a symptom of injustice, but an act of criminal disorder. For free black communities in the North, the rebellion carried complicated consequences. On one hand, it underscored the desperation within slavery. On the other, it intensified racist backlash. In several northern cities, free black residents faced hostility fueled by Southern fears exported through national media. The idea of armed insurrection unsettled white communities far from Virginia's fields. In historical memory, Nat Turner's image began to fragment. In pro-slavery Southern narratives, he was portrayed as a fanatic driven by delusion, a cautionary example of what happened when enslaved people were exposed to literacy and unsupervised religion. In abolitionist circles, interpretations varied. Some distanced themselves from the violence while acknowledging the oppression that produced it. Others argued that moral outrage should not ignore the system that made rebellion conceivable. During the Civil War decades later, Turner's rebellion was occasionally referenced by Union soldiers and Confederate sympathizers alike. For Confederates, it reinforced fears of internal revolt should Union forces advance into slave-holding territories. For Union strategists, the possibility of enslaved populations resisting Confederates became a calculated military factor. The psychological shadow of 1831 lingered. After the Civil War and emancipation, Reconstruction brought new challenges and new forms of conflict. Freedmen sought education, land, and political participation. White supremacist groups responded with violence intended to restore racial hierarchy. Although separated by decades, the memory of Turner's rebellion sometimes surfaced in rhetoric warning of black political empowerment. The past was used to shape narratives of the present. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, historians began formally documenting the rebellion within broader studies of American slavery. Interpretations reflected the biases of their times. Early accounts often minimized the brutality of slavery while emphasizing the violence of the uprising. Later scholarship, particularly in the mid-20th century, re-examined primary sources, slave narratives, and court records, situating the rebellion within systemic oppression. Archaeological and archival research in Southampton County has continued into the modern era. Scholars analyze land deeds, probate inventories, and family correspondence to reconstruct plantation layouts and social networks. Each fragment of documentation offers partial clarity, but also raises further questions. The precise routes Turner's group took remain debated. The exact conversations held in whispered planning meetings are lost to time. The document attributed to Turner, his confession, remains central to interpretation. Some historians argue it provides rare first-person insight into the spiritual worldview of an enslaved preacher. Others caution that Thomas Ruffin Gray, who recorded it, may have shaped its language to appeal to white readers or to emphasize religious fanaticism. The absence of an independent transcript leaves space for uncertainty. Public memory has evolved as well. In literature, film, and scholarship, Turner's story has been revisited repeatedly. Each generation interprets him through contemporary concerns about race, violence, resistance, and morality. Debates often focus on whether he should be understood primarily as a freedom fighter, a religious extremist, or a complex figure shaped by extraordinary circumstances. These categories, however, can oversimplify a historical reality marked by coercion and fear on all sides. The landscape of Southampton County today does not immediately reveal its past. Fields remain agricultural. Roads intersect quietly. Historical markers provide brief summaries, condensed into paragraphs that cannot capture the tension of those 48 hours. Yet beneath the calm surface lies a site where national fault lines once became visible. The rebellion did not dismantle slavery. Instead, it tightened its grip in the short term. Laws grew harsher, surveillance intensified, opportunities for literacy narrowed. Yet at the same time, it exposed a fundamental truth. A system maintained through force carried within it the constant possibility of resistance. Nat Turner did not live to see the Civil War, emancipation, or the constitutional amendments that followed. His actions were confined to a brief window in August 1831, but the reaction they provoked extended across decades, influencing legislation, rhetoric, and collective anxiety. In examining the rebellion with distance, one finds no simple resolution. There was violence initiated by Turner and his followers. There was violence embedded in the institution they sought to confront. There was retaliatory violence that swept beyond direct participants. Each layer complicates moral assessment. What remains undeniable is the impact. In 48 hours, a small group disrupted the illusion of permanence surrounding slavery in Virginia. They revealed vulnerability where dominance had seemed absolute. The response was swift and severe, reinforcing control while deepening sectional tension. The story of Nat Turner endures because it resists containment. It is not solely a tale of rebellion, nor solely of repression. It is a case study in how belief, desperation, power, and fear converge. It is a reminder that beneath structured systems lie human decisions, calculated, emotional, spiritual, that can alter the course of history. And in the quiet pre-dawn hours of August 21, 1831, in a rural county along the Blackwater River, those forces converged. The silence broke. The consequences followed. The echoes remain. Long after the trials concluded and the executions were carried out, the rebellion continued to exist in fragments, letters preserved in family archives, court transcripts folded into county records, newspaper clippings browned by time. Each fragment carried a perspective shaped by fear, justification, grief, or calculation. Taken together, they form not a single narrative, but a layered case file that resists easy closure. In private correspondence written in late 1831 and early 1832, White residents of Virginia described sleepless nights and guarded conversations. Plantation owners wrote to relatives in other states, detailing rumors of additional plots that proved unfounded but persistent. The fear was not only of violence, it was of uncertainty. The rebellion had demonstrated that enslaved individuals could organize quietly, plan deliberately, and strike without warning. That realization unsettled assumptions that surveillance alone guaranteed control. Insurance claims filed after the uprising reveal another dimension. Some slaveholders sought financial compensation for enslaved people executed or killed during suppression efforts. In official paperwork, human lives were reduced to monetary value, categorized, appraised, reimbursed. The language was clinical. The moral weight was absent. Yet those documents illustrate how deeply slavery was embedded in economic systems. Rebellion disrupted not only households but balance sheets. Meanwhile, among the enslaved population, communication shifted into subtler channels. Songs carried layered meanings. Biblical stories were interpreted in private spaces away from white oversight. The figure of Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage resonated differently after 1831. Although overt references could invite punishment, coded language allowed spiritual reflection to persist. The children who survived the violence in Southampton County grew into adults who carried memories shaped by family narratives. Some inherited trauma, others inherited hardened attitudes. For white families directly affected, the rebellion became a defining story passed down as warning. For black families, it could represent both courage and catastrophic consequence. Oral traditions preserved emotion long after written records fixed official versions. Nationally, the political temperature continued to rise. In Congress, debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories intensified during the 1840s and 1850s. Though separated by years, the memory of earlier rebellions, including Turner's, remained part of the rhetorical arsenal. Southern politicians cited insurrection as proof that slavery required strict defense. Northern abolitionists cited repression as proof that the system corrupted law and morality alike. When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, mandating the return of escaped enslaved people even from free states, it reflected a climate of heightened anxiety about control. Slaveholders feared loss not only through rebellion but through flight. Turner's uprising had shown the dramatic form resistance could take. Escape networks demonstrated quieter, persistent defiance. By the time Civil War erupted in 1861, the structure of American society had shifted dramatically, yet the underlying tension remained familiar. Enslaved individuals across the Confederacy seized opportunities to flee plantations as Union armies advanced. Some historians note that the Confederate fear of internal revolt influenced military strategy, diverting resources to guard against uprisings that never fully materialized on the scale imagined. The memory of Southampton County hovered as a historical reference point. After emancipation in 1865, formerly enslaved communities sought to establish churches independent of white oversight. In these spaces, religious expression expanded openly. The kind of spiritual interpretation that had shaped Turner's worldview could now be voiced without immediate legal prohibition. Yet the legacy of violence complicated celebration. Freedom arrived through war, not solely through internal revolt, and Reconstruction unfolded amid persistent hostility. In the late 19th century, as the South imposed Jim Crow laws and racial segregation hardened, narratives of the rebellion were selectively retold. Some white Southern writers minimized slavery's brutality while emphasizing the violence of the uprising, framing it as justification for strict racial hierarchy. At the same time, black intellectuals and activists revisited Turner's story as part of a broader history of resistance. Competing interpretations reflected ongoing struggles over memory and power. The 20th century brought new scholarly scrutiny. Historians began cross-referencing census data, land records, and legal documents to reconstruct a more precise timeline. Questions emerged about the scale of retaliatory killings, about the accuracy of reported victim counts, about the motivations of participants who left no written testimony. Each generation of researchers approached the case with different methodologies, revealing how historical understanding evolves. In the 1960s and 1970s, during the Civil Rights Movement, Nat Turner's name resurfaced in public discourse. Activists debated the ethics of violence in pursuit of justice. Some invoked Turner as an early figure of armed resistance against oppression. Others cautioned against romanticizing bloodshed. The debate mirrored earlier divisions, suggesting that the moral complexities of 1831 remained unresolved. Literature and film adaptations further shaped popular perception. Creative works often emphasized drama, compressing timelines or intensifying dialogue to heighten emotional impact. While these portrayals introduced Turner's story to broader audiences, they also blurred distinctions between documented fact and artistic interpretation. The boundary between historical record and cultural narrative became increasingly porous. In academic settings, the rebellion is now studied within broader frameworks of Atlantic slavery, religious movements, and resistance theory. Scholars examine how evangelical Christianity intersected with enslaved experience, how literacy altered power dynamics, how geography influenced tactical decisions. The event is analyzed not in isolation, but as part of a transnational pattern of uprisings in slave societies. Yet despite extensive research, certain details remain uncertain. The precise conversations held in the initial planning meetings are unknowable. The inner doubts or hesitations of individual participants cannot be fully reconstructed. Even Turner's own words, filtered through Gray's publication, leave room for interpretation. History preserves outlines. Human interiority often fades. What can be documented is the measurable impact. Legislative records show stricter codes enacted. Court transcripts confirm expedited trials. Newspaper archives capture language thick with alarm. Demographic data reflect changes in enforcement patterns. The rebellion left administrative footprints across multiple states. As the decades passed and the United States moved through civil war, Reconstruction, segregation, civil rights struggles, and into the modern era, the events of August 1831 never fully disappeared. They remained embedded in footnotes, in academic debate, in family lore, and in the uneasy space between condemnation and understanding. The rebellion led by Nat Turner became more than an isolated eruption of violence. It became a lens through which Americans examined slavery itself. In the years after emancipation, formerly enslaved families in Virginia began reconstructing genealogies that had been fractured by sale and forced migration. In some accounts preserved through oral history projects in the 20th century, Turner's name surfaced not always as a hero, but as a man whose actions brought consequences both inspiring and devastating. Some narratives spoke of courage against impossible odds. Others remembered the retaliatory terror that followed, when innocence offered no protection. These layered memories reveal how resistance and suffering were intertwined. White Southern memory followed a different trajectory. In certain local histories written in the late 19th century, the rebellion was framed primarily as a massacre, stripped of context and detached from the brutality of slavery. By isolating the violence of those 48 hours from the system that preceded them, these accounts shaped a narrative of victimhood that omitted structural coercion. The selective retelling served a purpose. It reinforced arguments for rigid racial hierarchy during the rise of Jim Crow laws. 20th century scholarship complicated those earlier portrayals. Historians began situating the uprising within a broader Atlantic world marked by slave revolts in Haiti, Jamaica, and elsewhere. Comparisons were drawn cautiously, recognizing differences in scale and outcome, yet acknowledging shared themes of spiritual conviction and strategic timing. Turner's rebellion was smaller than some Caribbean revolts, but within the United States, it stood as the most consequential slave uprising in terms of immediate casualties and legislative reaction. Researchers examined demographic records to better understand Southampton County itself. The region had a significant enslaved majority in certain districts, creating a demographic imbalance that likely intensified white fear after the rebellion. Plantations were often dispersed rather than tightly clustered, which both aided secrecy and planning and limited rapid communication once violence began. Geography shaped possibility and limitation alike. Psychological analysis also entered discussion. Some scholars have explored Turner's reported visions through theological frameworks common in early 19th century evangelical Christianity. Apocalyptic imagery and divine signs were not unusual in revivalist culture. Others have applied modern psychological perspectives, though such retrospective diagnosis remains speculative. What can be said with confidence is that Turner interpreted his world through Scripture, and that belief structured his decision-making. The legal aftermath continued to influence American jurisprudence indirectly. The expedited trials of accused participants highlighted how fear can compress due process. Court records show how testimony from enslaved individuals was handled inconsistently, sometimes accepted when it served prosecution, dismissed when it did not. The tension between security and justice revealed itself starkly in those proceedings. Cultural representations in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revived public interest. Films and novels reimagined Turner's inner life, sometimes drawing heavily from Gray's published confession, sometimes challenging it. Each adaptation sparked renewed debate. How should violent resistance to systemic oppression be portrayed? Can historical storytelling avoid either sanitizing brutality or sensationalizing it? These questions mirror the deeper ethical challenges embedded in the original event. Within academic circles, Turner's rebellion is now frequently taught alongside discussions of agency. Enslaved people were long portrayed in earlier historiography as passive recipients of oppression. Modern scholarship emphasizes that resistance took many forms: everyday acts of defiance, cultural preservation, escape, and in rare cases, organized revolt. Turner's uprising represents one extreme end of that spectrum. It demonstrates capacity for coordination and resolve, even under surveillance and constraint. At the same time, the human cost remains central. 55 white individuals were killed during the uprising, including children. In retaliation, an uncertain but substantial number of black individuals were killed, some with no connection to the revolt. A full accounting of loss must acknowledge both dimensions without collapsing them into equivalence. Violence unfolded within violence. A system built on coercion produced an eruption that then generated further bloodshed. The rebellion's immediate political impact tightened slavery's grip. Southern states imposed harsher restrictions on education and assembly. Opportunities for gradual emancipation debate narrowed after 1832. In that sense, the uprising achieved the opposite of liberation in the short term. Yet its long-term effect was to expose slavery's instability. It demonstrated that beneath enforced obedience lay unresolved tension. When historians trace the road to the Civil War, they identify many milestones: the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the doctored Scott decision. Nat Turner's rebellion is rarely listed as a direct cause, yet it contributed to the atmosphere in which those later conflicts unfolded. It hardened Southern defensiveness and Northern critique. It fed into a cycle of fear and argument that escalated over decades. Standing now at historical distance, the rebellion resists simplistic moral framing. To describe Turner solely as a hero ignores the indiscriminate nature of some killings. To describe him solely as a criminal ignores the systemic violence of slavery that defined his entire existence. The historical record demands complexity. It requires acknowledging context without erasing consequence. Final thoughts must return to the stillness of that August night in 1831. A small group moved through fields lit faintly by moonlight. They believed they were acting under divine instruction, striking at a structure that denied them autonomy, literacy, and family security. By dawn, households were shattered. By the following day, militias mobilized. Within weeks, executions were carried out. Within months, laws were rewritten. Within decades, a nation fractured. The legacy of Nat Turner is not confined to statues or textbooks. It lives in debates about resistance and morality, about faith and force, about how oppressed people navigate systems designed to contain them. His rebellion forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that slavery was maintained by violence, that violence can erupt from prolonged injustice, and that such eruptions carry tragic cost. History does not grant simple resolutions. It offers evidence, perspective, and the obligation to examine both. In the case of Southampton County in 1831, the evidence reveals fear on every side: fear of bondage, fear of uprising, fear of loss of control. Out of that fear came decisions that altered lives and shaped policy. The fields along the Blackwater River are quiet now. The houses from that era are gone or transformed, but the record remains. It reminds us that beneath legal systems and economic structures are human beings capable of conviction, desperation, brutality, and belief. The story of Nat Turner endures not because it provides easy answers, but because it compels ongoing examination. And perhaps that is where the investigation ultimately rests, not in verdicts rendered in 1831, nor in pamphlets published afterward, but in the enduring question of how societies confront the consequences of injustice. The rebellion was brief. Its reverberations were not. It also left intangible marks. The concept of security within slave-holding society was permanently altered. Confidence gave way to vigilance. Systems designed to enforce obedience had to reckon with the possibility of organized defiance. That shift in mindset influenced political decisions leading up to the Civil War. Standing at a distance of nearly 2 centuries, the events of August 1831 appear compressed in time yet expansive in consequence. 48 hours of violence triggered decades of reaction. The uprising neither ended slavery nor preserved it unchanged. Instead, it accelerated debates, hardened positions, and exposed vulnerabilities embedded within a nation's foundation. Nat Turner remains a figure who defies singular definition. He was an enslaved man shaped by religious conviction. He was the leader of a lethal revolt. He was captured, tried, executed. He became a symbol, then a controversy, then a subject of scholarship. Each layer adds context but does not erase contradiction. In Southampton County, historical markers now stand where plantations once defined daily life. Visitors read brief summaries of what occurred, often in measured language. The land itself appears ordinary: fields, trees, quiet roads. Yet history does not vanish with physical reconstruction. It persists in archives, in debate, in collective memory. The rebellion's ultimate outcome was not immediate liberation, nor simple suppression. Its true legacy lies in revelation. It revealed the instability beneath enforced silence. It revealed the lengths to which a society would go to preserve its hierarchy. It revealed that belief, religious, moral, ideological, can motivate extraordinary action under extreme constraint. And so the case remains open in a different sense. Not open in the way of unresolved criminal investigation, but open in interpretation. Each reading of the record invites reassessment. Each generation confronts the same essential tension between violence and justice, faith and force, oppression and revolt. In the pre-dawn stillness of August 21, 1831, a decision was set into motion. By sunrise, its consequences were irreversible. By nightfall 2 days later, a region was transformed. The echoes of those hours continue to move through American history, quiet, persistent, unresolved.